In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the menstrual cycle. This lesson will refer to the ovarian cycle from the previous lesson, so please make sure that you have a good understanding of that before watching this. These are the words associated with today's lesson. Please make sure that you are aware of the previous keywords as they will be used and assumed knowledge. Okay, so the menstrual cycle is another female cycle that occurs in tandem with the reproductive cycles of females. As we always say, the average cycle is about 28 days. However, this can be longer or shorter depending on the individual. For today's lesson, please make sure that you read pages 288 and 289 of your textbook. As you can see, there's a video here that gives a very short overview of the menstrual cycle. I would recommend that you watch it if you feel that you need something to help you set the scene. Okay, so as we know in the ovarian cycle, there are two phases. First is the follicular phase. And you can see at the top here, our oocyte is starting to mature and the follicle cells surrounding it increase in number. And eventually, the end of the follicular phase results in ovulation, where that egg bursts out of the follicle. If we're focusing on the endometrial lining here, you can see that during the follicular phase, there is uterine bleeding, which is menses, or the menstrual cycle or a period. And this is when the lining of the uterus is shed. And you can see that the thickness of that endometrial lining decreases and it remains quite low for the first maybe 3 to 4 days. After about day 5 of the follicular phase, the endometrial lining will start to increase. Now, this is because of this phase of the follicular phase. So about day 5 to day 14, we are in proliferation, or the proliferative phase. Now, proliferation simply means cell division, so we've got rapid mitosis of those endometrial lining cells. Excuse me, and what that means is that the uterus lining is starting to build itself back up. If we look at the other side, what we can see is the luteal phase. So the follicle has now got no egg in it and it becomes a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will slowly degenerate to become the corpus albicans. Now, if we look at the endometrial lining, we can see that it's really thick at this phase. I'll just take that away again. You can see that it's the thickest that it will be. And this is described as the secretory phase. So remembering day 15 to 28 is the luteal phase again. And in terms of the uterine phase, it's described as secretory. And this is because the uterus is maintaining its thickness because the corpus luteum is secreting really high levels of progesterone and estrogen. Now, we are seeing the start of a new cycle here because if no pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum can no longer be maintained and it will degenerate to this little thing, which is the corpus albicans, which can no longer secrete those high levels of progesterone and estrogen, and hence we get deterioration of the endometrial lining, and thus starting a new cycle. So putting that all together, if we look at the two hormones and how they relate, we can see that here. So estrogen levels start to rise as the endometrial lining enters that proliferative phase, and it dips down a little bit in the secretory phase, but it does remain significantly high. But you can see that the levels of progesterone are really very high in the luteal phase during secretion, and what happens here in the endometrial lining is it becomes thicker and more vascularized. Okay, so down here we're showing that there aren't as many blood vessels and we're still in that building phase of building up the endometrial lining again. Here it's nice and thick and vascularized, ready to accept an embryo. At the end here, at the end of the 28-day cycle, you can see that there is a significant drop off in estrogen and progesterone, which leads to menstruation. Now, all of this that we have just been talking about is actually controlled by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland on this MRI image that you can see here is controlled, is located here, and this controls the gonads. So in females, those are the ovaries. Now the gonadotropic hormones are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone, as we've mentioned before, will stimulate the development and maturation of the ovarian follicle from primary to secondary to mature follicle, whereas luteinizing hormone promotes that final maturation. It is directly responsible for ovulation, and it is responsible for forming the corpus luteum. Please make sure you remember those things. Now, the ovarian follicle itself, as we've mentioned in the previous lesson, is an endocrine gland, and as it develops, it secretes the hormone estrogen. So the developing follicle that is developed in the follicular phase secretes estrogen, and the role of estrogen is to stimulate repair of the endometrial lining and to develop it further. When we look at the corpus luteum, and you can see that here, this yellow body here, this secretes really high levels of progesterone in particular, but also estrogen. So just remembering that estrogen is focused on development of the endometrium, while progesterone is focused on the final preparation of the endometrium and maintaining it. So it's really important that the endometrial lining is maintained through high concentrations of progesterone, because if it's not, then a fertilized egg, or at that point an embryo, won't have anywhere to embed and successfully absorb nutrients. So just to summarize what happens. If we don't have fertilization, so we'll look at the right hand side first. If there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum, which is formed at the start of day 15-16, will degenerate to become the corpus albicans. And that happens by about 8 to 10 days after ovulation. Because the corpus luteum has developed into the corpus albicans, estrogen and progesterone concentrations are low because they are no longer secreted. As a result of progesterone and estrogen concentrations being low, the endometrial lining breaks down and we start a new cycle. So this is the normal situation as you know it right now. And if we look at fertilization, if that occurs, then we start to get a new hormone being formed called HCG, or human chorionic gonadotrophin, and we'll talk about that in later lessons. But just so you know, HCG is secreted by the placenta. So what's the difference in fertilization? Well, the corpus luteum is maintained, so it will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone, and hence the endometrial lining is maintained. Eventually, the placenta will start to form as the fetus develops, and this will take over the job of secreting estrogen and progesterone, and the corpus luteum will start to degenerate into the corpus albicans. And as mentioned in the previous lesson, that will start to happen by the end of the first trimester. Okay, so here's a summary of what we have just been discussing. So again, we start off with the pituitary gland here, shown in this little box. The pituitary gland secretes follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We can see that in the follicular phase, FSH, represented by this purple line, increases in concentration, and that directly attributes to the growth of the follicle surrounding the oocytes. So as the follicle grows, the oocyte starts to mature. Now again, as the follicle grows, the number of follicular cells increases, and those follicular cells secrete estrogen, which you can see in that blue line here. So you can see that the concentration of estrogen goes up, And as a result of estrogen going up, the endometrial lining continues to proliferate and repair. We can see that the FSH concentration dips down as the concentration of estrogen rises. And what we're showing here is negative feedback. So because estrogen levels getting so high, it starts to inhibit FSH. And then we have a little switch happening here, and we go into positive feedback. So the more estrogen you have, the more FSH you have. And this is significant round about day 14, because at that point, we've had low LH for all that time, and then suddenly it starts to surge, and that leads to ovulation. After ovulation, we enter the luteal phase of the cycle. And during the luteal phase, you can see that FSH and LH concentrations remain quite low. However, we have the formation of the corpus luteum, and as the corpus luteum is formed, there is a significant rise in the concentration of progesterone, which is shown by this dark purple line here, but also estrogen levels remain quite high, whereas in the first part of the cycle, the follicular phase, they were quite low. So progesterone and estrogen levels remain quite high because they are being secreted by the corpus luteum. Why is that significant? Well, these two hormones, progesterone and estrogen, will thicken and maintain the lining of the endometrium, ready to accept a fertilized egg. If that doesn't happen, if there's no fertilization, we start to develop the corpus albicans, and the corpus albicans does not secrete high concentrations of estrogen and progesterone that you can see here, and thus the endometrial lining can no longer be maintained, and it's shed during menstruation. Okay, so here's just another diagram to show you the same thing. The reason why I'm showing you this one is because different diagrams have all four hormones overlapping together, and while this can seem quite confusing, just take your time to look at where the peaks are. So remember, the line for LH is quite distinctive because it has one high peak round about ovulation. Estrogen is highest in the follicular phase. FSH is high in the follicular phase, and it has a small peak just under LH. And progesterone is at its highest concentration during the secretory phase, where you have the corpus luteum. So, as a summary, here are the hormones involved in menstruation. Please make sure that you understand the differences between these hormones and in what phases they peak, and what their job is and where they are made. The next few slides just simply show the different cycles, and I've stepped it through going a little bit at a time. So here you can see the first half of the follicular phase. I'd like to take time to describe what's going on here before moving on to the next slide, which has the summary. Okay, so here's a summary of what we just saw in that first part of the graph. FSH stimulates a potential egg from the ovary. The cells that surround the ovum start to develop. Those cells are called follicle cells. The follicle secretes estrogen, and estrogen stimulates rebuilding of the uterine wall. Okay, as we extend out that graph to about day 7, you can see that FSH is increasing and estrogen is increasing, and then FSH starts to dip down. So how do we explain that? So the initial concentration of estrogen is low. The low concentration has a negative feedback on FSH. So because FSH is low, it stimulates inhibition of the FSH. So it stops it from occurring. Okay. However, as you can see here, when the concentration of FSH gets really low, something else happens. It starts to reverse. So as the follicle starts to grow larger, larger concentrations of estrogen are produced, and therefore the effect is reversed. So now we have positive feedback on the secretion of FSH from the pituitary gland, and what that simply means is the more estrogen that we have, the more FSH we have. And this also stimulates luteinizing hormone to be released. So we can see in this little flow diagram, we have high concentration of estrogen happening. That tells the brain to start releasing more FSH and LH, which will stimulate those follicles further, which will produce more estrogen. And you can see that happening here. That line's going up, that estrogen concentration is going up, and so is FSH and LH. As we get to peak estrogen concentration, we then start to see an increase in LH concentration. Now the LH concentration, or luteinizing hormone, is the direct cause of ovulation, and what we have left inside the ovary is the burst follicle, which is called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will secrete high concentrations of progesterone and estrogen. So we know that progesterone will start to complete the formation of the uterus wall, and this increases blood supply and promotes glycogen storage. So if you think about why that's important, we know that the blood contains nutrients from digestion, and glycogen storage is simply a way that humans can store excess energy. So if you are preparing for the development of a fetus, it makes sense that you want to store that extra energy here. The rising concentrations of progesterone and estrogen will have a negative feedback on LH and FSH, thus preventing them from getting any higher. The reason why that's important is it stops a new cycle from forming, and you can see that here. Now, after ovulation, fertilization must occur within 2 days. If the embryo implants, then we have the corpus luteum being maintained. If there's no implantation, then the corpus luteum will start to break down, and this will directly affect the concentrations of estrogen and progesterone, which will also start to fall. Because of that falling concentration of estrogen and progesterone, the uterus will start to break down the endometrial lining, which is shed. So at that point, because there are low concentrations of FSH and LH, because there's low concentrations of progesterone and estrogen, then FSH is no longer inhibited, and that will start to rise again. And then okay, so here's a summary of what we just talked about. You can see that FSH begins to rise because it's not being inhibited by high levels of estrogen and progesterone. We can see that the uterine lining, or the endometrium, starts to shed, and we start to get menstruation, and as a result, a new egg starts to be stimulated by the rise in FSH levels, as you can see at the top. Okay, here's the complete cycle without any annotations. This is the end of the lesson on the ovarian and menstrual cycles. Please make sure that you've completed all notes and that you have read the relevant pages in the textbook to help you understand this process.